Oklahoman by birth, Californian by upbringing, and New Yorker by choice and longevity, Jim Story is a novelist, short story writer, and poet. He has published short stories, creative nonfiction, reviews, and poetry in a variety of literary publications. Has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, won a Best New Writers Award from Poets and Writers, and held a residency at the Edward Albee Center in Montauk, Long Island. Jim is the author of the novel Problems of Translation, and more recently, the forthcoming The Condor Shadow. Please join me in welcoming Jim Story.
Wow, that was really a wonderful, wonderful story. Thank you, Laura. I'm going to be reading 3 selections tonight from 3 different sources. First, I'll be reading from a new short story I just started a few weeks ago, or now I'm calling it What Goes Around Comes Around. The second is from Problems of Translation, my novel which was published last year, and the third is from The Condor Shadow, a novel which I completed recently but is not yet published. Because in about 3 weeks it's Valentine's Day, I've selected passages featuring moments of relationships, good, bad, or downright scary. I think it's interesting that Laura's choice of what to read and the choices that I'm making all have something to do with love and its manifestations and its problems. First, from my short story In Progress, What Goes Around Comes Around. My troubles began the day that Fidel Castro died. I know this because I was determined to read the entire coverage given over to the preternaturally famous Cuban revolutionary strongman in the New York Times. Not because I was Cuban. I was something of a polyglot in my heritage. I've been told I have Dutch, Irish, Russian, Swabian, Hungarian, Cherokee, maybe even Inuit blood running through my veins, but I've always imagined there might be a drop of Cuban in there somewhere. So I had finished the first page of the Times account of Fidel's life, laid out under the 36-point headline he no doubt deserved, when I sought the continuation on a later page where the obituaries commonly were. And there I discovered, in a smaller font but still alarmingly visible, the announcement of the death of my once and never-to-be future lover, Dulcimer Cornelia. That she had become a sufficiently notorious figure to be included in the pages of the Times was a surprise, but not now germane to my story. The print began to blur. Was this tears or just some kind of ocular anomaly? Dulcie had been prey to all manner of eye problems, as she referred to them, so maybe her ghost had bequeathed those problems to me. A hole opened in my belly and a chill wind blew through. I was reading the paper in the New York Public Library's cavernous reading room, and I immediately looked around to see if someone had opened a window. But I recovered and began to read further. She had died of a heart attack, which would have been at the bottom of my list of expectations for her exit from the tortured life she'd led. During the time we'd been together, she'd suffered from migraines, hence the suspect eyes, stomach problems, sinus infections, and type 2 diabetes, just to name the most egregious. Her brain waves had been analyzed, as had her sinus rhythms. During the 3 years we were together, the only medical problem I'd had was a busted hand from slamming it into a wall when she'd made me furious with her insufferable jealousy. You are already wondering, no doubt, why we had stayed together as long as we did. Well, start with the fact that she was the most beautiful, the sexiest woman I'd ever met. First to last, we couldn't get enough of each other. It was an exciting, near-satanic dance marathon, which ended only when we were both too exhausted to continue. The 90s might not have been as tempestuous as I'm told the 60s were, but we seem to be throwbacks to that period. She entered the coffee house without expression, struggling with a double-wide baby carriage, backed in carefully, knocked over the chalkboard listing that day's specials, caught it quickly with one hand, not letting go of the carriage handle with the other, straightened the sign, leaning it against the wall at a different angle, jerked the carriage around to complete her entrance, maneuvered with considerable difficulty past the backs of chair legs out too far, finally finding a vacant spot at the massive 12-foot table in the center of the front room before parking her vehicle and going to order her beverage. All this with a blank face. But when she settled in with her coffee, a weary, troubled look came upon her. An almost gutter despondency descended, such as one might expect from a Skid Row derelict, wondering where he would spend the night. She combed her fingers through her long, dirty blonde hair several times before finally managing to address her coffee. From the carriage, not a squall so far. Was there actually a baby aboard? Not to mention two? Thank you. Second, from Problems of Translation, as some of you already know, the protagonist, Charles Abel Baker, a mostly unknown writer of advanced middle age, is seized by a desire to see one of his short stories translated successively into 10 different languages, then back into English, a sort of literary version of the old party game, Telephone. Unsuccessful at getting a publisher to back his gambit, Charles decides to accomplish his goal himself and to accompany his story around the world. Along the way, he has lots of adventures, some funny, some romantic, some hair-raising. In this selection, Charlie is in India. He has met a young filmmaker who is doing a remake of Forster's A Passage to India. As this excerpt begins, she's just driven him from Bangalore to a set she's had built in the countryside, a mock-up of the famous Malabar caves, where she's preparing to film a scene from chapter 30, called What Happens in Vegas Stays in Vegas. They'd arrived at the set only moments before. Sajal had invited Charles to look around and then disappeared, no doubt to attend to some technical details of the scene that would soon be shot here. He took a few steps into the middle cave of the three he saw before him. He moved forward one slow step at a time. Before the light had dissolved completely, he sidestepped to a wall, palmed it, then inched forward using its surface as a guide. Should he light a match, he wondered? Then remembered that he carried no matches. Oh, never mind. What to do now? He decided to see whether Sajal's technician had reproduced the strange echo he'd read about in Forster's fictional recreation of the caves. What words should he speak to test it? Alone as he was, he felt safe to say, I wonder where the beautiful and sexy Sajal is at this moment. Although he hadn't expected to hear his own words come back to him in the thrumming overtones Forster had described, what did come back was a shock, the voice of his hostess. So you think I am sexy, eh? A trick? He hadn't seen her come in. In fact, no one had followed him. Charles was embarrassed. Oh my God, Sajal, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were here. A pause. Mortified, he whispered, "Are you here?" His face burned so hotly he feared it might generate a visible glow. He tried to discern the direction the voice had come from. "I really didn't mean to insult you," he tried again. Shh. A whispered command, but from where? Could she be behind him? She was. A moment later he had no doubt of this, as a pair of warm arms encircled his waist and joined themselves together across his stomach. Her full breasts pushed against his back. "Oh my God," he thought, "is this really happening?" At the same time, he made an unconscious effort to tighten his stomach muscles in a futile effort to eliminate his paunch. "Have you been fantasizing about Adela's experience in the cave, Charlie Baker?" Her voice was soft, teasing. "Mr. Abel Baker, Charlie Dog? The experience that did not happen to Adela, that did not happen to Dr. Assis, but whose reality is so palpable you imagine that it happened anyway?" She tightened her hold, pressing herself harder against him. "No, of course not. Nothing like that. I never thought of such a thing." "Of course you did, Dr. Baker. You are a man, are you not? All men think about such things." "Well, yes, but—" "Hush now," she said again, and her hands began moving all over. "Perhaps I have thought about such an encounter in these caves myself," she whispered, gathering tension in her voice. "Perhaps I have created them precisely for that reason. What do you think? We are totally in the dark now, Charlie, and no one will know unless one of us tells. Correct?" One soft hand moved upward to his chest. Unbuttoning his shirt, it slipped inside. The other dropped lower, found his hardness, traced its outline. "Sejal, shh." He could, of course, overpower her, pry her arms loose, spin her around, force her away, demand, in his most imposing voice, that she stop. Right. Like that was going to happen. Then, just when her fingers started toying with his zipper, when he felt his defenses totally breached, the hand stopped moving. The arms disappeared. Abruptly, with a strength that surprised him, she spun him about and placed his other arm, then his hand, against the wall. He was now turned toward the way he had entered the dark. "A non-event, Dr. Baker." Her voice was cold. "Just as in the novel. We must follow the script, correct? Nothing happened, all in the head. Walk forward close to the wall. Soon you will see the light." When he emerged into the shattering sunlight, he found the meager camera crew milling about. A kind of picnic seemed to be in progress. Some snacked on papadums, samosas, and pakoras that lay scattered across paper plates at a small folding table. Others fiddled with tripods, banks of lights. Sejal was nowhere to be seen. When she did appear, a half-hour later, it was from somewhere else. He never saw her exit the cave. She joked for a while with her crew, then began barking orders. It was as if she'd forgotten he was there. On the return trip to Bangalore, they rode in a silence as vast as the Deccan Plateau. His lip began to twitch, but there was nothing he could do about it, so he did his best to ignore it. Two thoughts kept circling in his head, as if searching for somewhere safe to land. The first, fueled by a bubbling anger, was that he had been played. He had not seen that coming. He'd been duped, soiled, tossed away like a used dust rag. The second, totally incompatible, was that maybe he had fantasized the whole thing. It was dark, he could see nothing, so maybe it was wish fulfillment. But if that were the case, wouldn't he have wished for consummation? At the door of the hotel, she flashed him a coquettish smile, then roared off into the night as if nothing had happened. Thank you. My third selection is from the new novel Condor Shadow. On a depleted gypsum mine in the California foothills, a 15-year-old boy shoots and kills a man. Frightened and uncertain, he runs away, moving from town to town and state to state for 20 years, changing jobs and changing names, unable to connect with anyone for fear he will be found out. The Condor Shadow is a story of twisted courage, a struggle for love and connection, and a desperate search for redemption. And in keeping with this evening's theme, I've chosen a scene in which my hero, who is now called Rusty, meets someone who may turn out to be the love connection he craves. When his cat, on her nightly run, streaked across the bottom of his bed, Rusty Thomas stirred briefly. He heard the muffled thump of a 9-pound body slamming against a wooden roadblock, but ignored it, changed position, dropped back into sleep. The cat, whose name was Burgundy, was always trying, and always failing, to make that leap to the top of the highboy. A few hours later, however, when Rusty awoke for good, he discovered this time had been different. Burgundy, instead of being curled up on the easy chair where he usually found her in the morning, lay alongside the piece of furniture which had been her nocturnal target, head fixed at an odd angle. Her body was already cold. Rusty sank back onto the bed. His shoulders drooped. "Damn stupid cat," he said finally. "Goddamn stubborn, stupid cat." After he had drawn on his clothes and used the toilet, he wrapped Burgundy in an old t-shirt and hauled her outside to bury in the backyard. He selected a shovel from an assortment of tools, propped against one wall of the small bungalow, and chose a spot near the yellow roses. The house was a rental, but Mrs. Davidson had told him he had full leave to plant flowers or vegetables or whatever he wanted in his yard. He supposed that privilege extended to his cat. After the burial, he stood a moment, regarding the freshly turned and mounded earth with a blurry eye, before finally heaving a huge sigh. "Damn stupid cat," he repeated. Then he returned indoors, this time to the living room, a tiny space whose dimensions were diminished further by the presence of a looming gas stove the size of 2 ocean-going trunks, quiet now since it was summertime. Sat down on the edge of a formless old divan and wept. He wept first for the cat, then for the state of the world in the year of our Lord 1965, which he valiantly tried to keep track of by a faithful parsing of newspapers and radio. He didn't own a television. And finally for his own miserable, roving, lonely life. A life that had grown noticeably darker now that Burgundy was gone. I'm skipping a couple of pages in the book. He drives up into the mountains on these pages to clear his mind, to regenerate himself a bit. He knows a lot about birds and trees, and being among them quiets him. Driving towards home, he felt calmer, though the image of Burgundy leapfrogged through his mind from time to time. Back on East Isaacs, he stopped for a cup of coffee at a diner he'd often thought of trying, a fairly new place on the outskirts of Southeast City. Though he lived more or less in the heart of town, near the college, he preferred the periphery. Inside, there was only one waitress and no other customers. He took a seat in a booth along the side. She approached him, coffee pot already in hand. "Cuppa?" she asked. "You bet." She filled his cup, retreated behind the counter, and resumed swiping down its surface. As she was emptying ketchup bottles into others, she looked up and called out, "Another?" "Please," he said. "Why not come over to the counter and keep me company while I work? Should it be that the last two people left on Earth don't even talk to each other?" He smiled, hauled himself out of the booth, and brought his cup to the counter. "Fill me up, then." While she continued to work, he looked at her. A few years older than he, perhaps, 34, 35. She had a slender, almost elfin build, but there was something tough about her, an edge. Dishwater blonde hair cut in a page boy, bangs draped over her forehead, freckles across the bridge of her nose. Every once in a while she extended her lower lip and shot a column of air upwards such that her fluttering bangs disclosed somewhat lighter eyebrows. Some old injury had left a scar along her hairline, he noticed. Her eyes were small and dark, merry one moment, wary the next. Or probing, could be. In fact, he began to see her eyes as loaded like a shotgun, ready to explode into 1,000 meanings, a firefall of moods. As he continued to regard her, some old memory relaxed her dark lips into a smile that opened her face as if it had suddenly been turned towards the sun. Amused by his gaze, she arrested her work to stare back, one hand on an outthrust hip, apron jiggling slightly from a tapping foot. "Hey," he said suddenly, "I just won a contest on the radio. They called and asked a question that I answered correctly. Congratulations." "No, what I mean is, they sent me a lot of merchandise I can't use. Stuff from local stores. Promotion, I guess. So you have any use for—" He hesitated, looked away, looked back. "A pair of medium-length taupe nylons?" She was quiet for half a beat, then responded, "What was the question?" She had a nice voice, he decided, pitched low but syrupy somehow, warm. "Excuse me?" "Oh, the one I answered, you mean. They asked, did I know who was the first American into space? And I did. Alan Shepard." She studied him then, as if toggling between two choices in a hand of poker. Finally she grinned. She stepped back, lifted her skirt a few inches. "Matter of fact, I do," she said. There was a run in one of her stockings, extending from mid-thigh on down. "Yes," he said, "I see." After the hem of her uniform had dropped down like a curtain, he cleared his throat and looked away a moment. "Well," he said, "there you are, then." Without another word, he exited the cafe, went to his pickup, and returned with a glossy package. Thank you.